Hey guys, welcome to the show. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr., and we are going to talk about why a boy develops same-sex attraction, why a young boy develops homosexual attractions. And this is going to be a fascinating discussion because I have been reading his father's book, Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Sr., called Shame and Attachment Loss. And this book blew my mind. Everything he says in this book, I was just like, whoa, this is exactly what my childhood was like. And I just want to say up front, ultimately, I believe that developing homosexual attractions is ultimately a spiritual thing because of the fall, because of the corruption of sin. So I think that's ultimately the issue. But we can also learn a lot from just observation and look at family dynamics and see, what are the factors that propel this forward. And so Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. is a licensed clinical psychologist, author, researcher, and clinical director at the Breakthrough Clinic in Southern California. He oversees what is likely the largest clinic in the world that specializes in helping men with unwanted same-sex attractions. So please welcome Joseph Nicolosi Jr.
Thank you, Becket. I'm grateful to be here on your show. I know a lot of people talk about sexuality on your show from a religious standpoint, so I feel grateful that we can be here together and I can bring a different perspective, a scientific perspective. And I don't think these perspectives have to compete with one another. I think they could actually enhance each other. So
And by the way,
I'm
you are a Christian, right?
yes, yes, I
Okay.
am.
Yes. So tell us before we get into shame and attachment loss, which, as I said in the intro, blew my mind. Um, Tell us a little bit about your dad and why he got into this field in the first place, and then why you took over the mantle after he passed away.
So my father got started in this field because he was a Catholic. So he started a Catholic psychotherapy clinic. And many men who would come to him had unwanted same-sex attractions. And he didn't know how to help these people. He would just listen. And he began by making two observations. The first observation he made was that men who came in to see him, who right off the bat appeared guarded, ill at ease, they had kind of a defensive posture. They come into the clinic. Hi, would you like me to sit there? Should I say, okay, is that okay? You know, they had like a stance. They had a posture toward him. And he
Mhm.
was able to tell right away that men who demonstrated that posture were much more likely to report having same-sex attractions versus the other guy who just walks in and thoughtlessly plops down on the couch and just starts unloading about his life. That was less likely to be a man who had same-sex attractions. So the first observation was that these men were more likely to have a guarded posture toward him, which he later found out that these men they had this posture toward men in general.
Mhm.
And the second observation he made was that upon listening to these men, he began realizing that they were all describing the same family pattern. And so he started with those two observations. He had no training from his graduate school about what leads to the development of homosexuality, can sexuality change? And so he had to do his own research. He went into the psychological literature and eventually he began discovering an entire body of literature about this topic that was being covered over by the psychological establishment.
And then why did you decide to take this on as well?
On a personal level, I believe that everybody should have the freedom to pick their own therapy goals. And I see people with traditional values who are being underserved. Their values are not being taken seriously. These people can go into, I'm in California, so this is what we see in California here. People will come into a psychotherapist and say that they're having conflict about their sexuality, and the therapist will affirm them in that a direction that is LGBTQIA plus, go on and on. But if the same person says, hey, I want to move toward having a monogamous, traditional, heterosexual life, these clients are being told that they're just suppressing who they really are. And I think that's an injustice. It frustrates me. I think it gives me a passion in this topic. And um, I think a great disservice is being done to these people, and they're not being told the truth. They're not being told that sexuality can change. And I think that is what fires me up about this.
And in shame and attachment loss, the gay affirmative therapists see the shame as internalized homophobia
Yes.
versus what you see. So can you just kind of describe what that means, internalized homophobia?
Yes, yes. Well, what internalized homophobia is the concept that if an individual feels shame about his homosexuality, if he feels elevated shame in general and he deals with same-sex attractions, it's probably his internalized homophobia. It's the negative attitudes, the heteronormative, heterosexist views of society that he has internalized, and that is the only reason why he cannot accept his homosexuality. If he can just overcome that, he will be just as happy and healthy as anybody else. That's the concept.
Right. And so your approach obviously is in stark contrast to that.
Yeah, so my father's approach and the one in shame and attachment loss, I want to be precise about this model that my father developed for over 30 something years. So the basic model is this. As kids grow up, they go through different developmental stages. So a 7-year-old and a 1-year-old are going through different things.
Hmm.
So the kids grow, they go through these developmental stages, and the developmental stages are the same for boys and girls up until about 2.5 years of age, give or take a few months. This is what's called the gender identity phase of development. This is the first time that a boy has an additional developmental task that the girl doesn't have, and that is to disidentify from the mother and to identify with the father. And in some homes, that task is a lot harder for the boy. And according to the theory, according to the model, based on 1,000 men that my father treated, or more than 1,000, when the father is more distant or detached, critical, and the mother is more high anxiety, over involved, and sometimes intrusive, and we have a boy who's more
You're
temperamental.
talking about my life. You're literally talking about my childhood. But go ahead.
Okay, okay. So it's hitting home for you. So
Yeah.
distant detached father, boy who's temperamentally sensitive. You put those factors together, and that's going to make it a lot harder for the boy at that particular developmental stage. Now, you can add to it other factors as well. If there's a bullying older brother, sometimes there can be in the lives of these boys, there's sexual abuse, which can make it even more confusing for the boy and make it harder for him to experience himself as a guy among guys. So as these developmental patterns interfere with this boy's stage of development here, what that means is the boy will try to reach out to the father, but if the father doesn't reciprocate, the boy experiences a hurt. My father called it a narcissistic hurt because the boy at 2 takes it personally. Oh, there must be something about me that's unworthy in a
Mm.
gendered sense. And so he experiences this hurt. He retreats back to the mother and doesn't make that gender identity shift. And the consequence of of what happens in that stage it's an impact that is felt in the other developmental stages. So as this boy gets older, oftentimes girls are his closest friends. He knows them like the back of his hand. But boys are a mystery. Boys are exciting. Boys are intriguing. There's an exotic quality to boys. He sees this boy in this situation will see other boys as a little bit scary sometimes. These guys
Hmm.
are roughhousing and they're wrestling, and this boy oftentimes has difficulty feeling like he can fit in. And the cumulative consequences of this is that this boy experiences this hurt. He feels insecure in his sense of maleness, and he fundamentally lacks the male attention, affection, and approval that his other male peers got. And those unmet needs become sexualized typically in early adolescence. And that's where we start to see, according to the model, this development of same-sex attractions.
Yeah, and let's talk about the concept of the kitchen window boy because that really struck me that because when I was a child, my 5 brothers were out playing football in the yard. I was in the kitchen always with my mother and probably my mother's girlfriends. And it was like this dynamic of I would look outside and just kind of want that, but feel like I couldn't attain that. And I felt safer or I just felt more comfortable and at ease with women and with my mom. So what, talk about the kitchen window boy.
Yeah, the kitchen window boy, he's looking out and seeing other boys playing on the street, and he's there with mom and his sisters, and they're braiding each other's hair, and this kid's like looking out the window. It's like this looks like a whole different world. It feels alien to me. And the boy
Hmm.
wants to connect, but doesn't know how to, and it just feels like an impasse.
Yeah, and in shame and attachment loss, it says among same-sex attracted men, we often see a temperament that is sensitive, emotional, relational, and more aesthetically oriented than the gender typical male. Why? So, and then it goes on to say this contributes to the boys' often reported feeling of discomfort around other males, including their fathers. So, talk about that a little bit. Why? How does this aesthetically oriented thing, this component, get? How does that happen? Because it's true. Like when I was young, I would notice things. I would notice aesthetic things. I mean, that's why I was a production designer, and it's like, but I would notice these things aesthetically that none of my siblings would notice or my parents would notice. I was always kind of like, I don't know. It was like this weird kind of superpower I had. But what is that about?
Mhm. So there may be two components, there may be two causes of the component that you just described. One is some of this is based in genetics. Temperament does appear to have some genetic basis. Some kids just are born with a more rambunctious, resilient stance toward the outside world, and others are more sensitive. So part of it could be genetic. The other part of it could go back to the early relationship with the mother. So we're going to really go into some sensitive territory here, Becket. So we already have, but we're going to go even further into that. So the sensitive temperament, this, what set the stage for that may have been the early relationship with the mother. And I mentioned the relationship with the father, but many of my clients have mothers who are higher anxiety, and some of them can relate to the boy in a more narcissistic way. And some of these mothers felt themselves during that early phase of development, the first few years of the boy's life. Sometimes it's because they felt separated from their husbands, or there were other conflicts going on, but the mothers looked toward those boys, and in their high anxiety and sometimes conditional ways, their mode of relating to the boy would sabotage the boy's individuation, his development and being his own person. So I can give you an example of a client who I saw yesterday or the day before. And when this man, he's now like a 40-year-old man, married and has kids, but does have some same-sex attractions. When he would attempt to individuate from his mother and go out and roughhouse or sometimes just say no and be his own little individual, in his relationship with his mother, the mother would really put the brakes on that. When the boy would try to assert an opinion, the mother would say, "Are you sure? Are you really sure you want to do that?" And it would
Hmm.
undermine the boy's sense of being able to make his own choices. And so we put focus on the father at age 2, but going back even earlier, there are some relational dynamics with the mother which can set the stage for that temperamental sensitivity in the boy.
Yeah, and I think I read this in this book. I can't remember where, but even when the boy, a 1 year old, starts to learn to walk and realizes he can be separated from the mother, if the mother somehow intrudes on that separation and is like, "Oh, no, no,
Yes.
no, be careful," or "Oh, watch out," like
Yes.
that's really bad for
Yes.
the child, right?
Yes, so for a boy who doesn't have that temperamental sensitivity, it may not have the same impact on him. But for the boy who is more sensitive, yeah, the mother's heightened anxiety. Don't get dirty. Don't play with that boy. You're going to get hurt. No, you can't do that. It gives him a sense of like of heightened fearfulness,
Hmm.
and he has a hypervigilance.
The back to the book, it says some children, because I wanted to ask about how do we know this isn't fully genetic or fully biological? It could be hormonal in utero.
Yes,
But it says some children may indeed have a biological predisposition to homosexuality, but predisposition is not the same as predetermination.
that's right.
Explain.
That's right. So a temperamental sensitivity could be genetically based, and that's true. But that doesn't mean that it's a gay gene where it's a determining factor. Like I have this gene, I guess that's how I have to be. That wouldn't make any sense in terms of genetics for several reasons. Number one, we know that it's not completely genetic because of twin studies. So if it were genetic, then all identical twins where they have the exact same genes, they would all be in pairs, both heterosexual or both homosexual. And we see it is not a perfect rate of concordance. So many times we'll see a gay identified twin and a heterosexual twin. So it can't simply be genetics. Um, there have
What is the rate of concordance?
well, the rate used to be understood to be roughly 50-50. So if there's if one had same-sex attraction, there's a 50% chance the other one would be heterosexual. But the newer data that's using larger sample sizes is actually saying that the concordance rate is actually even less. So they're more discordant. And so the newer studies, which as we are doing the larger population studies, which is actually coming more out of the Netherlands, we're starting to have to really revise it. So right now, I don't think we have an exact number, but I think we're seeing that 50% figure is falling rapidly.
Okay, let's now look at the family dynamic of the mother, father, and son. So the father, in the book, it says the boy experiences his father as hostile, emotionally detached, or both. Although he may be highly competent in the business world, he is seen by the boy as non-salient in family life, failing to be both good enough and strong enough. Uh, which is which is interesting because that's that's what happened to me as a child. My father was very competent and as a lawyer. He was very capable. Woke up at 5 in the morning. My dad had 8 kids. He was very competent, but I experienced that detachment from him just because and again, I don't want parents to feel like, we're blaming them, or I want them to just see that these are really important observations about why a child develops same. I wish, after reading this book, I was thinking, I just wish my dad were still alive so he could read this book and we could have a conversation about dad, because my dad never he was such a man's man and so old school, like he never quite he didn't understand why I turned out to be gay. He didn't really get it. So talk about that and how the father, that kind of detachment from the father, when does that start? When is a child supposed to attach to the father?
You're bringing up several good points. Let me just go back to something that you said earlier. This is about naming, not blaming. We're not here to assign blame to people. And it's true that we're talking about constellations of factors. So it may not be the exact situation for every single person. There
Yeah.
might be, I can tell you a third of my clients were sexually abused when they were young. And they can say, some of the model fit, but there was this particular day when this event occurred, and I did not experience homosexual attractions before that day. After that day, things went in a different direction. So
Hmm.
there are a variety of factors, and we're not here to assign blame to anyone, but there can be other factors outside of the family, like sexual abuse is another example, or bullying can also be a compounding factor.
Hmm.
So again, going back to this is about naming, not blaming, and every situation is different. This is not a perfect cookie cutter model. We're speaking in generalities. But to go back to your point about your question about when is the boy supposed to bond with the father, you could go to a daycare in Manhattan. You could in upscale Manhattan. You can go to a tribe in Uganda. You are going to find boys around 2.5 who get this surge of interest in gender. And they're going to be into, it shows up in different cultures, but in our culture, it's going to be Superman, Batman, Iron Man. The boy is often drawn to these larger than life male figures, and we see it again and again and again. And at that developmental stage, the boy is trying to figure out, wait, there are two kinds of people in this world, and like, which one am I? And the girl is thinking this too at this developmental stage, but the boy has the additional task of saying, well, I've been identified with my mother my whole life, and I'm different. My body is different. I'm more like this other guy. Language adds to this because I'm being called he instead of she. So I guess I have to make a choice here. And so with language development and all this, it's right around 2.5, give or take, I would say 3 months.
Okay, and then the mother, it says the mother's attentions are typically described by the son as over-involved, intrusive, possessive, and controlling. The relationship between them is particularly close and excludes the father, and often just there's often a feeling of, we're soulmates or confidants. She confides her own emotional needs to the son as well as her chronic dissatisfaction with the father. Now, again, this is exactly what happened to me. And on the next page, you talk about, the the son, his equilibrium, he maintains his equilibrium by offering her the sensitive and relational son who serves as a spousal surrogate. And it's interesting because my, childhood and my, into high school and college, I felt, and even beyond that, I felt like I was my mother's surrogate husband because, he didn't give her the attention she wanted, or the whatever needs weren't satisfied with her. She turned to me to fill those needs. And so talk about that for a second, because that's so it's just so true. And I mean, I literally, for my entire life, I felt like my mother's happiness was dependent upon me.
That right there is referred to as, there's a phrase, as the liability of specialness.
Right.
Liability of specialness. On one hand, I have this special relationship that my siblings don't have with mom, and in a certain extent, that even my own father doesn't have with mom. This feels great. This feels like a great privilege. At the same time, there's a liability to that specialness because when the mother is sad, when the mother is hurt, the boy feels like it's incumbent upon him to be her listening ear, to cheer her up, and that places a burden on the boy. And this is a great illustration of something very politically incorrect, but this is an illustration of what we, when my father talked about the narcissistic dynamic with the mother and the son, it's not to say that the mother is a narcissist. It's to say that unconsciously, the mother is looking to that young boy at that developmental period for needs that for to meet some of her own needs, and that places that burden on the boy. And we have the liability of specialness that happens at that early age, but that liability of specialness has an effect much later on as that boy becomes a man. Because when that boy starts to feel pressure from society to move toward heterosexuality, if that boy is anything like the 500 clients I've personally treated, when that boy starts to go into dating, he has a propensity to take too much responsibility for the woman's needs. And it feels like just too much. And he wants to retract himself from her. And dating feels like it feels like a burden. And many of my clients say, I can't understand why my other male peers are so excited about dating. For me, it feels like a drain. And it is hard for them to relate to the woman in an intimate context while simultaneously feeling grounded in their sense of masculine identity because they
Mm.
slip back into that mode. And it's like, this isn't pleasurable, this isn't enjoyable. And it goes back to that early liability of specialness dynamic.
Yes. And this is a little repetitive, but it's important because I want to drive this home. It says, the mother invests herself in this particular son whom she can control and mold. Fortunately, she has none of the objectionable aspects of her husband, but in her possessive love, she engulfs him. When the couple argues, the son sides with the mother and identifies with her hurt and anger, which is, again, what happened to me. I resented my father my whole life in a certain way because my mother would complain about him so much that I felt like I would always side with my mother. And so I would have this kind of anger towards my father. And she inadvertently, my mother turned me against my father in a certain way. Is that common?
And I like how you said inadvertent. Yeah, it was not her intention. Many of these mothers would say that's the last thing I want to do. In fact, if anything, the mother feels like it's her job to be a go-between the sensitive son and the father who has his own stuff. And the mothers are typically attuned. They're seeing the dynamic. And so they feel like they have to be the go-between, where they go to the father and say, look, he's really sick. Can you talk to him about this? Or they go to the son and say, well, try again with your father. And but what ends up happening is inadvertently that can drive a wedge between father and son.
Yeah, I remember, I mean, my whole life, just whenever I needed something like money or whatever, I would never go directly to my father. It was always my mother was the go-between. I would ask her, she would go to him, he would tell her, and she would come back to me. I would never ask my father directly for money. So that's very true. Now, the father-son relationship, it says our clients commonly say, quote, I never knew my father. Minimal or non-existent, their relationship is characterized by poor communication and lack of openness and trust. The father is seen by the boy as distant or critical. Father and son almost never speak about meaningful issues, and personal disclosure is avoided. And this is, again, this is true in my case. My father, and my father is amazing. He was great, and he's in heaven now. He's thrilled. He was a great dad in so many ways, but it just in terms of this dynamic, um, I I never felt like I could talk to him about anything. I mean, when we would our conversations were, he would come home from work and say, "Hey, Beck," and I would say, "Hey, Dad," and that was it. And then I'd like go to my bedroom and hide. Not hide, but I would just kind of, I never ever felt comfortable
Mhm.
just alone with my father or in the car with my father alone. I never felt comfortable. It was like this awkward feeling my whole life, even until he passed away, like in 2016 or 2015. So, do you have any comment on that?
I have a few comments on it. And permit me, if you will, to get a little nerdy here for 2 minutes, okay? A little
Get
detail.
nerdy.
Okay, let's get nerdy. I think this is really important. There are many people, LGBT researchers, LGBT clinicians, who would say, okay, look, we know from the psychological literature that men who are gay identified are much more likely to report estrangement in their relationship with their fathers. And we know this from the psychological literature overwhelmingly. But what they would say is, okay, it's not because the father did anything that would have contributed to the boy's homosexuality. The boy was born gay. He was effeminate from the beginning. And what happened was, is the father, because of his own internalized homophobia, he consciously or unconsciously recognized the effeminacy in his son, and he retracted, he pulled back from the son.
Hmm.
And that is why in other words, what they're saying is there is no correlation, there's no causation, only correlation when we look at the boy's gay identity and the estrangement from the father. They're just, it's the father's reacting to the son. So that's one perspective. There's the other perspective. And from that perspective, no, the distant critical relationship with the father did contribute to the boy's same-sex attractions in two important ways. Number one is because of the lack of security in that relationship, the boy did not feel a sense of strength in his masculine identity. He didn't feel secure in it. The second impact on the boy is that the boy is lacking the male attention, male affection, and male approval that he longs for, the boy longs for, and those needs kind of get buried underground and then come back up in a sexualized form in adolescence. So we have these two competing theories here.
It's like the
And
chicken or the egg. Which came
the
first?
chicken or the egg? Thank you. So how do we figure out, and this debate has been going on for easily 50 years. How do we resolve what the relationship is here between these, and which view better explains the data? So there was a clinician named Dr. Sherry Golden who did her doctoral dissertation on exploring whether or not we can find an answer to this question. And she did her dissertation on it, and then she also did an article on it, which I have right here, the relationship between father involvement and father role confidence for fathers of gay sons. Anybody can go online and look this up if they want to do a deep dive, but I'm going to summarize it. So, so in her research, Golden measured 70 fathers of gay identified men with three well-established psychological measures. And what she found was that these fathers were shown to exhibit what she called indirect, non-nurturing, or low engagement types of father involvement activities with their gay sons, rather than direct, nurturing, and high engagement activities. And now many of the gay theorists would say, well, we know that. It's because of the father's internalized homophobia. But she went even further into it, and she looked at the fathers of gay men and looked at their relationships with their fathers, because
Mm.
how a man fathers is often easily predicted by his own relationship with his own father. So her study confirmed that those fathers who demonstrated the lower levels of engagement with their young sons, they also reported receiving less involvement from their own fathers in their childhood. So, in other words, the results indicated that the father's past involvement with their own fathers was, in fact, a predictor of how those men fathered their gay identified sons. And this indicates that the parenting patterns that we're talking about today with the fathers of gay identified sons, those were patterns that those fathers experienced in their own childhoods with their own fathers. Now, a person may say, well, wait a second, but why didn't those fathers end up having a gay identity? And there were probably several factors. Number one is those fathers had a different temperament, okay, than the sons,
Mhm.
their gay identified sons. Their relationships with their mothers may have been different. There may not have been sexual abuse. Their relationships with their older brothers could have been different. And so
Mhm.
this goes back to the idea of a constellation of factors. And so, but we do see this over and over. And my father, who treated over 1,000 men, when he would ask his clients, tell me tell me about your father's relationship with his father. And sometimes he'd have the fathers there in the therapy session, and he would ask them directly. Those fathers would virtually never talk about their fathers, in other words, the grandfathers of the gay sons, in warm terms. It was usually like, yeah, my father, he was okay, but they rarely spoke it in a warm, endearing way.
Okay, so I want to get back just briefly. You mentioned the hostile older brother. It says in the book, it says the brother is likely to be feared and the relationship will be hostile. Everything comes easy to him, especially in sports, and that also the father and this older brother typically get along better and share interests and are more alike. Why is that relationship hostile with the older brother?
There are probably several factors, one of which is that the boy may be picking up on the fact that the younger brother has a special relationship. There's a specialness that the younger brother has with the mother. And so the boy is
Mm.
feeling a bit left out, and there could be a little bit of jealousy in that. Another component of this is that the father is letting him get away with it. So, so the father's not intervening, and so the boy just keeps bullying because it apparently is okay with dad. And sometimes the dad is even, I won't say encouraging, but he's letting it happen because he thinks, look, it's best for this young boy. It'll toughen him up. And so through his silence, the father is indirectly giving the okay in some of these
Mhm.
situations. And so those are some factors that may be present. But it really is the father's job to put a stop to this in all cultures. In all cultures, it doesn't matter which. When the father picks up on the fact that the younger brother is being routinely bullied by the older brother, it is incumbent upon the father to intervene. And these fathers, for a variety of reasons, are not doing that.
Well, I'll tell you the reason my father didn't intervene is he thought, and he didn't know any better, but he thought that this kind of was quote unquote toughening me up, like it was going to make me more tough. What my father didn't know is that was going to make me even more gay or more, whatever let's just use the term gay because it's
Well,
easier.
can we say this? Let's be even more specific. That bullying adds another compounding factor that reinforces for the boy his notion that he really is different from other males around him. He is
Hmm.
a different type of guy. And so when we have the liability of specialness with the mother, the detached critical relationship with the father, the bullying with the brother, the fact that the dad isn't putting a stop to it, each of these layers confirms the notion that I guess I really am different from other guys. And I'm going to borrow a phrase from one of your other guests, Rosaria Butterfield, who used the term ontological. She taught me
Yeah.
what ontological. I like ontological. Now I love ontological. So it was from watching your other guests talk about ontolo. This is an argument about this is an ontological argument. Is the boy just gay at his core and he was born that way, or is there a different explanation? But when you add each of these factors on, it reinforces the notion that I guess I'm just ontologically different. I just belong over here, not with these other guys. And then when the same-sex attractions occur, that can also reinforce, I guess I am different. And then when the boy hears from the culture, oh, you have these feelings, that's just who you are, you're gay. And the gay label we're talking about later on the boy's development,
Right.
but the label it does two things. First of all, it brings a sense of relief, like, well, there's a reason I have these feelings, and there's an explanation for why I felt different for so long. So the
Hmm.
gay label brings a sense of relief, but it also reinforces the boy's notion that he really is different from other boys around him. Now we even have a name for this. He really is different. And so each of these factors just loads onto this sense for the boy that he is categorically separate from other males.
Okay, so I just want to quote this and see what your response is from the book. Gradually, inevitably, the boy begins to develop a fascination for that essential part of his own identity that he has failed to claim. He will begin to seek it out there, quote unquote, in the form of another male, feeling intense romantic longings. In puberty, these longings for his own masculine power will become eroticized.
So when I work, I'll just speak about the clients who I've seen. When a client comes in, we'll sometimes do this in the first session. I'll ask my client, tell me about your ideal sexually attractive guy. What would that guy be? Give me a description, and we'll go in. Is he taller than you? Is he shorter? What color is his hair? What's his personality? How does he dress? Get specific. If you're sexually attracted to a part of his body, be precise. What is it? His abs? Is it his legs? What is it? Do you want more body hair, less? It's like this whole exhaustive list. And okay, once we've got that list, I'll say, okay, great. Now let's switch gears. Let's talk about the kind of man you would like to be. Any body you'd like, any attitude you'd like, what would that be? And so often my clients find that what they are attracted to in another man is what they would like in themselves.
Mm.
We see this again and again and again. The psychoanalysts had a name for this. They called this eroticized envy. So we see this over and over, and it's not true for all of them, but I would say for about 80% of my clients, that's what we see.
And then it says other narcissistic features we have often seen in homosexually oriented men include self-preoccupation, emotional distancing, excessive concern with external appearances, restricted self-insight, uh, a tendency to choose image over substance, and a tendency to be easily hurt and offended by others. This is in gay culture. I mean, when I was living that life and all my friends, we would talk about this all the time. We talk about how gay men are so concerned about their bodies that the term we used to use was gym bunnies. They were these gym bunnies. And so why do, because that's, I mean, that's been my experience is gay men are so kind of fastidious about their appearance. And what do you think what is that caused by?
There are probably several factors. One is, as we talked about earlier, the boy's propensity to sensitivity and awareness of aesthetics, that might have a partial genetic contribution there. There might be a
Mhm.
partial explanation for that. But many of my clients felt that because of the constellation of factors they had growing up, they felt insecure in their sense of maleness and in their sense of male worth. And so they would sometimes try to counterbalance that
Mm.
by really looking good, by really looking, by putting perhaps an inordinate amount of attention into how they're coming off. I think there's another factor that is not mentioned in my father's book, but I have seen it with my clients. Um, in a random sampling of the general population, obsessive compulsive disorder shows up about 3 to 5%. So 3 to 5% of a random sampling of the population meets the criteria for OCD. With
Mhm.
my clients, it's 33%. And I'm not the only one seeing this. So the American Psychological Association says there is no connection whatsoever between homosexuality and elevated levels of pathology. They strongly imply that. Okay, there was a major study from the Netherlands, a population study, that looked at this and found that men who identified as homosexual were far, far more likely to be diagnosed with OCD. So it's not the majority of men. It's still definitely a minority. But there are many people who have OCD and they're obsessive about their looks and how am I
Mm,
coming off? And they're constantly revisiting in their minds, how did I come off when I said that? Was that okay? Was that not okay? And there's that may contribute to
mm.
the preoccupation. And so we got OCD, we got this the genetic component, and frankly, there may just be a component of narcissism here. And that adds to the self-preoccupation.
And why are some gay men or homosexual same-sex attracted men, I don't know how there's so many, let's just say gay because it's just easier, but why are so many gay men, why are some effeminate, super effeminate, and some not at all? Like, where does that effeminacy come from?
Here is what my father would say. This was the answer that he had in his book. I think this is in chapter 2 or 3. And by the way, if anybody wants to go to look at the book or look at this information, go to josephnicolosi.com. If you put your email in at the bottom, we'll send you 2 chapters of this book, a couple chapters that are free on audio. So you'll just get free chapters that explain this. And I think one of the chapters goes to that exact question. So um, so why are some of them more masculine and why are some of them more feminine? My father's explanation for that was it depends on when the injury occurred. If the trauma occurred before the gender identity was solid, so let's say around 2.5, then you're going to get a guy who's more effeminate. If it
And by
occurred
what do you mean,
after,
just to clarify, what do you mean by the trauma?
oh, the relationship with the father, excuse me, where the boy reaches out to the father during the gender identity phase, and he doesn't, his attempts are not reciprocated, and he experiences a hurt and retreats back to the mother and doesn't make the gender identity shift.
Right.
So my father would say that constellation is going to lead the boy in a trajectory that's more likely where he is going to be more effeminate. Now, if the boy made the gender identity shift, and this is probably about 20 to 30% of the clients that my father treated, if he made the gender identity shift and he feels like he has on a fundamental sense some masculine identity, but there's a trauma that occurs right after that, then you're going to get the guy who's the more masculine type. So examples of that would be age 4 or 5 or 6, the boy is sexually abused. 4, 5, 6, there's a traumatic experience that really scares this boy, and the father doesn't help save the boy and take care of him and give him the soothing that the boy needs. So maybe the parents are going through a divorce or there's some kind of crisis going on in the father's life, but the boy feels like, wow, my father really wasn't here for me. I really wasn't worthy of that connection from my father. So the boy has a more of more strength in his sense of masculine identity. He's not going to be effeminate. And if you're okay with this, Beckett, let's just go right in. Let's be very real here for a moment. The
Yeah.
terms in the gay world are tops and bottoms.
Yeah.
And so the tops have more of that. They report having more of that sense of masculine sense of identity.
Hmm.
And that may be an explanation for why we see tops and bottoms.
So we'll talk about the good little boy a little bit. What is the what are the factors involved in that?
When the boy experiences his closest relationships as insecure and performance based, he's more likely to take on this persona of the good little boy, the compliant good little boy, because there's a payoff to be the compliant good little boy, which is that you get a sense of attachment security. I can please other
Um,
people. So every kid wants that. It's an immediate payoff. The problem is that when he is the good little boy, when he is the teacher's pet, when he does everything right, it does sometimes fuel the resentment of the older siblings. Like, hey, why you look like you have it all together, and there's like a jealousy about that. There's an anger among some of the peers, like you're just too squeaky clean, you're too perfect, and it brings up these negative feelings in the peers. So that's one component of the good little boy. The good little boy role ends up becoming a straitjacket as the boy gets older. and he has to be compliant and make others happy. And his desire to be individuated and his desire to be disagreeable, which is a very natural impulse for anyone to have. That desire comes out in indirect ways. And we see this. This is the argument my father made. We could see this in gay pride parades, where these guys are theatrical, over the top, transgressive, flaunting the transgression. And it's like a total counterbalance to the lives that they lead. So I'm going to give you an example of a client I worked with. He went on an app, I won't name it, and an acting out experience with a guy who seemed very tough. He seemed like a Green Beret. He actually wore like an army uniform and very dominant sexually. And like 3 days later, he saw this guy in the produce section, and the guy was like super wimpy. His voice was like a whole register higher. Uh, are these the cucumbers? Where are the tomato? Like it was, and my client saw this guy. It was like a complete turnoff. Like what? It was just a persona. And we see this a lot. There's that element of theatricality, and the element of theatricality is counterbalancing something that's going on in the man's day-to-day life.
Yeah, and your dad talks about this is a good segue. He talks about the allure of theater and acting. Why is that an allure for gay men or gay men?
Because the boy feels insecure in his relationships with others, one of his defenses is to go into fantasy as a way of coping. And in fantasy, he can have total control. He can avoid the conflicts. We see this a lot, and there's a lot of psychological literature in terms of trans. So the children who we are now labeling as transgender, I mean, this goes back to the Rorschach studies. This goes back to the childhood drawings. And this is not me saying this. This is the clinicians and the researchers. But these boys, even more in the trans world, from an early age, they are using fantasy as an attempt to avoid conflicts in their day-to-day life, which we expect are probably is going on in the family. So, from an early age, the fantasy defense of deal of to avoid conflicts eventually becomes brought into the allure of theater and acting, where the boy can continue um, delving into fantasy and spending a lot of his life there.
Yeah. Now talk, what is the delight deprived boy?
All children want to be delighted in. I have twin daughters, and they're 3 years old now. They're constant, Dad, look at this. Dad, look at this. I drew this. Look at what I'm doing. And it's constantly like, am I good enough? Am I this? Look at this. Look at this. It's all the time. And they want to be delighted in. Every child does.
Yeah.
And that's look at this, see what I drew for you. And they show you what they draw, and they kind of look like, are you happy with what I drew? Am I okay? And every child wants to be delighted in. And my clients will often report that they wanted to be delighted in by their fathers and other males around them, and they didn't get it to the degree that they needed. And so many clients later on sexualized it. And I'm going to be
Mm.
really blunt here. I'm going to give an example of a guy who I am treating, and I'm using him as an example because so many other clients in my practice um, report something very similar. This is
Hmm.
the guy who goes out on these apps. This is what he's doing this every week. He goes out and finds other people to have sex with. And the peak moment of the sexual fantasy, the guy may change, the setting may change, the sexual act may change, but the peak moment is always the same. In the peak moment, of the fantasy, the other masculine guy is looking at him and giving him an attitude like, I like you. And that is like his rush. And he's going out finding man after man after man after man. And it's like wanting a man to delight in me. And when my client talks about his childhood, he didn't have that. And he needed that and longed for that from his father, from his grandfather. He felt like he wasn't good enough. And for those brief moments during the sexual acting out, he feels like I am enough and I am enough to another guy. So, in a gendered sense, I am enough.
Yeah, and is that would does that explain why typically gay men are very promiscuous?
Yes. Well, that I want to get something off my shelf. Here. So there are gay researchers who who wrote this. So this book is called The Male Couple. I'm looking at the back. It's endorsed by the former president of the American Psychiatric Association. This book was written by two gay researchers named McWhirter and Madison, who did a study to try to figure out how many gay couples are actually monogamous. And the authors themselves were a gay couple. Okay. So one was a gay psychologist, one was a gay psychiatrist, and in relationship with one another. And they undertook the study to disprove the reputation that gay male relationships do not last. Okay. So if there is ever going to be a study that is biased towards saying that gay male relationships last, it's going to be this one.
Hmm.
They studied 156 male couples. Of the 156 couples, can you guess how many of them were found to be monogamous after 5 years?
0.
Zero. Zero. The
So
whole study they undertook and they found it was zero. So what did they say? This is what they said. They couldn't find a single couple that remained monogamous. I just want to read this. Just a quote from the book. After all this work, they said, the expectation of outside sexual activity was the rule for male couples and the exception for heterosexuals. Heterosexual couples lived with some expectation that their relationships were to last until death do us part, whereas gay couples wondered if their relationships could survive. At the end, they say, if you're in a gay relationship, don't even try to expect monogamy because you're just going to set yourself up for frustration. In fact, it could make the relationship end sooner. So the best thing to do to maintain your relationship is to have consensual, what's the new term for this? Consensual non-monogamy. So let's
oh yeah.
redefine, let's move the goalposts. So monogamy isn't you don't have sex with somebody else. Monogamy is you let me know beforehand. And if you can do that, then okay, we'll move the goalpost and say that we are a monogamous couple. And that was their conclusion at the end of the study.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of, my back when I was in that life, I had a lot of people, because people are going to say, oh, but what about, I have friends who are married, two gay guys who are married, and surely they're not. But in my experience, and what you're saying, in my experience, those relationships are all almost always open relationships after a certain, if not right away, after a certain period of time, they become open relationships. And I want to get back to why. So guys who who are homosexual, who are promiscuous, who are going to this kind of thing to try what ultimately what they're doing is trying to resolve that childhood injury. So or that childhood trauma. So can you kind of tease that out a little bit? Like how does a gay man think that's going to resolve it, but it doesn't ultimately?
So according to my father's theory, he saw homosexuality. We're going to get kind of psychoanalytic here for a moment. He saw homosexuality as something called a repetition compulsion, where the
Yes.
person he's engaging in the same behavior over and over, and it's like, I hope this time maybe I'll get what I want. And by the way, there were studies that try to find out what is the number of sexual partners for a gay identified man over the course of his lifetime. And the numbers vary dramatically, but they tend to be somewhere between 250 sexual partners to 1,000 sexual partners over the course of the man's life.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
So the term repetition compulsion, and the client will feel like I have to act out, and that's why some of these apps and these websites are so compelling. The client feels an urgency, like I got to do this right now. So the repetition compulsion has several components to it. One of them is an attempt at mastery. An attempt at mastery. So this time I'll get a masculine guy to like me. This time I will win over an unavailable male. This time I will be the dominant boss and I will get an attitude from another guy that I've always wanted where he'll look up to me. And so they are often acting out these unmet needs. So they're trying to there's an attempt at mastery. My father would say the second component of a repetition compulsion is there is always a built-in element of self-punishment. And no
Mm,
one wants to look at this. There's always a built-in element of self-punishment. He would say the very act of homosexuality is in and of itself an act of self-punishment. And the fact that the client is going out again and again and again, and there's a disregard for oneself. Like
hmm
there's no thought of for many of these clients, I'm talking about the particularly sexually addicted guys, there's no thought of like, could I get a disease in this or in
hmm
this act where I'm going to some guy's car in a parking lot at 3 a.m. Like this could be really like he just goes, he's in a certain mode, he's in an acting out mode, a tunnel vision mode without regard to himself. So there's a component of self-punishment. And the last
And it's
one,
almost like an attraction to danger, right?
yes, there's an attraction to danger. There's what we call danger excitement. Like it actually adds to the thrill. Like, let's do
Mm,
it. It's
hmm
crazy. Let's do it. It helps to counterbalance the good little boy safe mode I'm in all day long, where everything's very prescripted.
Wow.
There's a sense of adventure. There's a sexualized sense of adventure. The final component is what my father called an avoidance of an underlying grief, in that these men are using sex to avoid a grief, a loss in their life. And when that loss starts to come to the surface, they use sex to cover over it. So when the man has a sudden urge to act out sexually, if you go back moments earlier, there's an emptiness in him.
hmm
His boss slighted him at work that day. He was talking to his male friend, and the male friend was on his phone and ignoring the guy. There was some kind of injury that the client had. And by going into a compulsive sexual behavior, he can upregulate himself out of the emptiness that he feels.
There's this quote in your father's book that is interesting, and maybe you can kind of explain it a little better because it's interesting, but also a little confusing. It says, clinical observation of children as young as 4 months old show the infant in a hyper aroused state. You'll have to explain what that means. Trying to defend himself by giving back cues to the mother, such as gaze averting, like averting his gaze. The mother ignoring the gaze averts, and the child arching its back to get away from her while she keeps looming in and attempting to engage him face to face. What is this all about?
And let's be clear for the audience, it's not Gays, it's Gaze. Just so
Yeah,
everyone knows.
that's I
You read
avert
it
your
correctly.
gaze. Avert your gaze. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Get the gaze out. No, that's not that kind of gaze. So there is only one defense that a human being is born with. We have all sorts of defenses: denial, projection, transference. There's only one that a human being we can see on day one, and that is dissociation. So when the infant is overstimulated by the outside world, the infant will dissociate. I'm going to try to check out. So when the mother is overwhelming the child, looming over the child, tickling the child, just overstimulate. The infant is like, I can't handle this. And so the infant will provide cues, usually more subtle at first, but they'll build up if the mother or the caregiver is not like responsive to it. But the cue is like, this is too much for me. So the child will look away, will look up, usually in the corner of the room. The child will arch the back, like, I'm trying to get away from you. This is too much. But the mother who is not attuned will continue to overstimulate the infant. And the infant will have to dissociate, like, in other words, check out from the
Mhm.
experience in order to feel an inner sense of calm. And so it is thought that mothers who have higher anxiety can sometimes miss those cues, can be a bit more sometimes intrusive. Obviously, we're talking to varying degrees here, some mothers less than others. But those mothers, when they miss the cues, the infant learns my only way out of overstimulation is to check out into defensive dissociation. I'm going to check out. And so that defensive pattern may have set the stage for the boy's subsequent propensity to want to use fantasy as a defense against his real life conflicts. And you can take that even further, and we might speculate that that might explain some of the draw toward theater and acting, or why the allure is very strong on some of these boys. But that's the basic concept.
Right. Okay. And what about boys who don't have a father at all? Like their father died or there's no father in the picture at all. Why don't all of those boys turn out to be gay?
My father would had his response to that was, and I'll do my best to summarize it. It's not the absence of a positive father figure, it's the presence of a negative one. And
Hmm.
so the presence of the negative is more painful and can create more of an injury for the boy, the gender identity injury. In addition to that, many boys will not have the good father that they wanted, and sometimes there'll even be the presence of a negative father experience for the boy. But a male surrogate, a father surrogate will be there, a grandfather, an uncle, someone else to be there for that boy who can help, in a sense, bring the boy into the male world, to invite him into the male world. And especially during a critical phase of development. So, was there a father surrogate? That's one factor. Temperamental sensitivity is another. Some boys are more prone to emotional injury than others. And then we have the other issue of, is there a bullying older brother, a feared hostile relationship with a bullying older brother? So those other factors may help explain why boys with a negative relationship with their father, or a father who passed away early, why those individuals do not have same-sex attractions.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, I'm going to quote this: the pre-homosexual boy. By the way, you can explain what pre-homosexual boy means. The pre-homosexual boy grows up disembodied, quote unquote, that is alienated from his own body, especially his genitals, which disconnects him from his biological based gender vitality. Not surprisingly, he then begins to envy the masculine bodies of other boys in a compensatory attempt to acquire other male bodies by erotically joining with them.
Of the 500 patients I have treated, when I've asked them about what is a guy you're attracted to, I cannot think of a single counterexample of the 500 I've treated. One characteristic that my clients find attractive in other men is a man who is comfortable in his own body. He's
Hmm.
comfortable in his masculinity. He feels at home in himself. They often, if not always, my clients find these kinds of men attractive. And this may go back to the psychoanalytic concept that male same-sex attractions are based in eroticized envy. And so my clients don't feel oftentimes comfortable in their own bodies, but they do envy other men who appear to be. They appear to be really at home in themselves and very integrated in themselves. And my clients would love to have more of that attribute for themselves. And so that is the psychoanalytic explanation for what we might be seeing.
What about this concept your dad talks about in the book, my special girlfriend? Like, because it's common, at least when I was growing up, it was common, very common for this, a homosexual guy, boy, teenager, whatever, later to have a very close relationship with a woman or several women.
Many of my clients report feeling a sense of distrust towards other men, and it's hard for them to feel relaxed and be themselves with other guys. They oftentimes feel like they're ill at ease. They're
Hmm.
on guard. They're on guard for, we call this anticipatory shame. Like, no one shamed me yet, but I feel like at any moment I may do something that's going to get a negative reaction from one of these guys. So they're in a state of more vigilance. This is what we call defensive detachment. Um, so many of my clients feel more comfortable with women. As we talked about earlier, growing up, their mothers oftentimes, and often their female friends were their closest friends, and they feel more comfortable with them. And being with these women feels more safe and familiar and comfortable. And for many of these women, there's a trade-off for them as well, because they get male attention without the conflict of and pressures of having the guy as a boyfriend. And so some of these clients describe these kind of relationships with these women as symbiotic.
Yeah, I mean, I was when I was reading this, I was thinking back on my life, and I really, the closest people in my life, my friends, were either gay guys or women. It was very rare that I was, in fact, I don't even know, I can't think of a time that I was super close with a heterosexual man. Because there was that, again, it was just kind of like me. It just reminds me of being in the car with my dad alone. that just being uncomfortable, that awkwardness and not, and, but, I found for some reason, for whatever, for what you're saying, I found that going to women or to other gay men was much, much easier. And so that was really the bulk of my, and I sometimes would have, I did have some male friends who were heterosexual, but we would call them, we used to call them snags, sensitive new age guys. They were just like really sensitive heterosexual guys. And I was able to be very close with a couple of those kind of guys in my life as well. So, so I can testify that what you're saying is true.
So there's a name for what you described, which is defensive, well, defensive detachment is what I mentioned earlier, where many men with same-sex attractions can hold a posture of protectiveness, self-protectiveness around other guys, like you mentioned with your father in the car. And it is thought that defensive detachment is based on anticipatory shame. The client is like bracing himself to be shamed at any moment. So when
Hmm.
you're in the car with dad, you went like this with your hands. Like it was something like that's that may be the anticipatory shame. Like if I say something, if I don't say something, if I do something, I'm going to get some criticism out of nowhere from dad that I didn't see coming. And so that's the hypervigilance. And no one wants to like live in that hypervigilance. And so what were they called? The snags? Is that it?
Snags,
The
sensitive new age
snags.
guys.
That's right. Okay, so thank you. So the
They weren't
snag,
really, by the way, just to put this out there because I know I'm
yeah,
gonna get they weren't actually new age, but that was just a funny way of saying it.
yeah.
Anyway, go
They're
ahead.
sensitive guys. They're sensitive
Yeah.
feeling kind of guys. And so those guys may be less likely to prompt the anticipatory shame response in you. But the more rough and tumble kind of these kind of masculine, stereotypically masculine guys, they may raise that feeling in you of the anticipatory shame.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the true self versus false self. Your father says the false self accommodates the need for social belonging and acceptance while simultaneously offering self-protection against possible future shame moments. So talk just a little bit about the true versus the false self.
When we are in our true selves and we're being assertive, in other words, the authentic expression of our emotions, when we are in our true selves, we are our most vulnerable to shame.
Hmm.
So we can develop a protective, defensive posture called the false self. And we touched on this earlier. The good little boy mode is a false self for many of my
Yeah.
clients. And that mode has a protective function where if the boy's in the false self, he's less likely to be shamed because he's not expressing a deep need to anybody. He's not putting himself out there. And many of my clients felt like when they tried to be their authentic selves, they were shut down and shamed, whether it was criticized or maybe ignored. And so they retreated and they kind of went into this false self, which is ultimately a self that has one protective function at its core, which is to protect the client from shame.
Yeah, you just reminded me of when I was a kid, we would sit around the dining room table as a family, and all my seven siblings were there and my parents. And it's funny, like because I in elementary school and high school, and I mean to this day, like I was a very funny person. I've had a very good sense of humor, and when I was with my friends, I mean, we would laugh all the time. But when I was in that dynamic of my family, I felt like I couldn't be my true self, or I couldn't, it was weird. I kind of just shut down at the dining room table. And I was very quiet. I remember being very quiet all the time at the table and thinking to myself, if only my siblings knew that I'm a really funny person. And they never really do that until I think much later. I think they got that. But is that a common thing for the homosexual boy?
It's very common from what my clients tell me, and I just want to point out a couple of things. When you started talking about it, your hands were expressive, very funny, and then as you began to talk about the table, there was like this thing that went, there was like a stiffness that came over you, and then you kind of went back to, oh, but then later on they found out that I was fun. Like, but the body shows us where we're at, and so there we were actually, I was watching you going into that. Um, and many of my clients, that posture is the anticipatory shame posture. When you shame a child over and over and over, especially in unexpected ways, the child goes into the false self, or what we've called earlier the good little boy, and now he's in anticipatory shame. No one was actively shaming you at the table. You were just quiet, but you were in the anticipation of shame, and that is enough to prompt the shutdown that you're describing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really crazy that I was quiet all the time. I want to talk about just this is the last thing we're going to talk about. There you're in the book there your father talks about this four different styles of false self. There's number one, there's the passive compliant, aka the nice guy. Number two, the theatrical entertainer. Uh the guy who thinks I have to be Mr. Personality, um, which is driven by anxiety and ultimately it exhausts him. That was very much me. I always thought, I would go to parties and just think I had to be Mr. Personality. I would, and by the end of the party, I was just drained by that because I was just on. I was so on. Like I could be completely just at zero, at level zero. But as soon as I walked into a party, I would just boom, like a switch would flip, and I would be so on and so entertaining and so funny, and I loved that kind of affirmation I was getting.
Yes, yes,
The
yeah.
third, the third, the third type is the false self is the outrageous, hyper feminine character, like the drag queen, and then the fourth is the angry activist, hyper masculine character, and these are kind of like militant gay activist groups. I remember I just want to talk about this fourth one for a second and we can go back, but I don't know if you know who Larry Kramer is, but in the I think it was the 80s, yeah, in the 80s he started this group called Act Up in New York, and they were
Yes.
very like it was about AIDS, and they were like, they were furious, and they were so there is that it's so funny that your father points out these four different kind of false selves because it's so on point. I mean, there's gay guys that I know that are passive and compliant. There's the theatrical ones, the entertaining kind. There's the outrageous, hyper feminine guys that it's almost like, as your dad says, the gratification for this false self is found in shocking others,
Mm.
and then the angry activist. So, do you have any kind of any other words of wisdom about these four different characters?
Those are different personas, and it's right. There's a payoff. There's a shock. People remember me. I'll be seen. I'll have an impact on others, and there's a payoff to being in those four roles.
So, I guess the $64,000 question is, what is the antidote to all of this?
There's probably no one antidote for everybody. It's going to look different for every individual. So let me give you some examples. Some men are going to have to do grief work, and grief work can be done with a psychotherapist like me. It could be done in a pastoral setting. It could be done outside of a pastoral setting. A good example of this is in the book of Job. This is an example, an illustration of grief that's probably at least 2,500 years old. The example of Job, where Job is just sitting with his friends, and they're just sitting there in silence while he grieves his losses. So there are different examples of how a person could grieve. There are different examples of how a person could move forward in his path. I think it depends. You gave an example earlier, Becket, with the word fastidious. Some men are fastidious. So one example of an antidote, as you called it, would be if I were treating a man who's fastidious and wanted to work on that, so he's excessively preoccupied with how he looks.
Hmm.
An effective technique is something called exposure. There's exposure therapy. So if a guy is excessively preoccupied with having to have his hair just perfect, then an exercise would be to mess up his hair and set a timer, and for we usually say about 7 minutes, and just look at yourself the way you don't like to see yourself in the mirror, and just look and look and look for about 7 minutes, and do that regularly. And that can help decrease that sense of hypervigilance that I have to look perfect. Sometimes it's as simple as having a good friend who knows you really, really well and knows when you're going in the true self and the false self. And when you're with that person, maybe you mentioned Beckett going to that party and being on, having that friend who he's there and you know that he knows. And
Hmm.
it's like, oh yeah, I'm going into that mode again. Like that helps. It's very hard to be in the false self and also know, oh yeah, I'm in the false self, and like to call yourself on it at the same time. So there are different ways for every person. Um, I'm working, I just finished working on a placebo-controlled study. It took me 1,000 hours to complete. It'll be published next month in a peer-reviewed journal. In fact, by the time this recording is out, it'll probably be already published, on a very rapid intervention that is used to treat unwanted sexually arousing memories. So if a person has memories that are arousing, that the person would like to no longer be arousing, maybe it was a sexual abuse memory, we have some interventions that reliably uh, decrease that arousal. And so everyone's path is different, and everyone's going to have to fumble through this for
Yeah.
themselves to figure out what works for me.
And I just tell me, because I know your father has written other books. What are some other resources your father has besides Shame and Attachment Loss? This book.
So my father's first book it's a pretty introductory book, Reparative Therapy of Male Homosexuality. This can all be found on josephnicolosi.com. You go scroll down to the bookstore. Reparative Therapy for Homosexuality. The second, another book he wrote was A Parent's Guide to Preventing Homosexuality. This is for parents who are concerned about their child. And then, of course, there's Shame and Attachment Loss, which you talked about. This also, there's an audio version. If people go to josephnicolosi.com, if you scroll to the bottom, there's a place to subscribe to the email list. If you do that, then we send you a couple chapters of this audio book for free. For those who are interested. And on the website on josephnicolosi.com, there are a lot of interviews my father did. Oprah, Bill O'Reilly, Dr. Drew, he was on 2020, a bunch of ones where he's Dr. Phil. Sometimes he's giving a long explanation, other times he's combative and argumentative. And so it's both educational and entertaining. But those are all free on josephnicolosi.com.
Okay, we're gonna leave it there. We'll link to your website below. So thank you, Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. for coming on. This is very helpful.
Thank you, Becky. Can I say that I'm a fan? Can I say that I've
You're
watched your
you're a
show and
fan of my show?
I am a fan of your show. I've watched your
Oh,
show. I've learned a lot from your show. And I
oh,
love how you
good.
go in there and you have guests who I just love, and you're really on top of the topics that I think are so important today. So I am definitely a regular viewer of your show. Thank you.
Well, thank you. All glory goes to God. Thank you guys for watching, and we will see you next time.